In this video, I'm going to talk about cable flare and how to avoid it. If you're a subscriber, welcome back. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I'm happy to have you here. If you enjoy this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing. So cable flare is something that happens when you transition between one stitch pattern into a cable pattern. Cable stitch patterns pull in quite dramatically horizontally and have a larger stitch gauge than most other stitch patterns. Therefore, you need more stitches to accommodate the same width when you're in a cable than you would in another stitch pattern. And this causes the top and bottom edges of these cable transitions to flare. And so that's where this comes from. Knowing the gauge is key to eliminating cable flare. Let me show you what this means. Here's a cable swatch that doesn't account for cable flare happening. This is the top edge. So we're transitioning into a seed stitch, and we have cables with reverse stockinette background. Look at the difference here where cable flare was accounted for. We still have it now. It's a different kind of a cable, but similar concept. Cables with reverse stockinette stitch background transitioning to seed stitch, but the top edge where you transition is nice and square. There is no flaring occurring. So what you need to do in order to compensate for this is have a swatch of your cable and have a swatch of the stitch pattern it is going to be transitioning into, whether that's something like seed or ribbing or whatever else. And know the stitches per inch of the transition stitch pattern, and then know the stitches in a particular width for your cables. And it will depend on how wide of an area you're using your cables. If I was using two cables like this, I would measure these cable stitches because the tightness of the cables happens in the cable, not in the reverse stockinette stitch portion most often. So you want to know how many stitches are in this cable and how wide is this cable. And then knowing the stitches per inch of your transition stitch pattern, you can determine how many stitches do you need in this stitch pattern to equal that same width of the individual cable. And so each cable will get a number of stitches that need to be added or removed as you are moving into or out of this cable into the other stitch pattern. So the stitches in this width are going to be a higher number than the stitches we need here in this stitch pattern. Therefore, when we move into a cable, we need to work some increases directly below where the cable will be placed. And then when we move out of the cable, we need to work some decreases directly above the cable as we move into the next stitch pattern. This helps to relieve this flare. And so each cable will get that number of stitches. And in this instance, I believe it was 2 or 3 stitches that are needed to remove out of the cable as you go into the seed, or to add into the seed at the last row of seed stitching leading into the cable. And so here that was done. There are increases added right below each cable and decreases added right above each cable as you move into and out of the transition stitch pattern. So that's how you work it if you have individual cables like so in certain spots in your design. You will figure out the stitches needed for each individual cable. What if you have a cable pattern that is an all-over cable pattern? This is still an example of individual cables. So this cowl, the bottom edge of this cowl has this cable ribbing that transitions into wider cables. And each wider cable gets some increases. And then at the top edge, there are some decreases. So this is an all over cable pattern, but it's still individual cables. And so each cable gets treated individually in the fabric. And you'll notice that here this column doesn't need anything done to it because it just continues all the way down from ribbing to ribbing. I don't have a swatch to show this an example of all over cables, but what if you had an all over cable that was transitioning across the entire fabric and there was no finding of individual cables? Well, in that instance, you'll still need to know the stitch per inch gauge of your transition fabric. And then you would need to know the stitches per inch of the all over cable pattern. And then you will evenly apply those increases or decreases across the entire width or circumference of your fabric to account for the flare moving in between a cable and an all over cable and another stitch pattern. Hopefully that makes sense. Have you experienced cable flare in your projects? Did you not know how to deal with it? Or have you dealt with cable flare before and were you successful or unsuccessful in those attempts? Let me know in the comments below. I hope this was helpful. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.